What if a decision you made in the heat of the moment is changing your entire story without you even realizing it? It wasn't a huge mistake. It was something small, something that seemed like a solution. That feeling of trying to fix your own life, acting out of exhaustion, pressure, or fear. Today, you're going to understand how a single action can change everything and what can still be repaired. There are people who look at their mistakes today and think everything started in that exact moment. One wrong decision, one rushed choice, one impulsive action, but it almost never starts there. Before the mistake ever appeared, there was already a silent exhaustion happening inside. The weariness of waiting, the fear of wasting time, the emotional pressure building up without anyone noticing. And when the mind reaches its limit, a person doesn't make choices thinking about destroying their own life. They make choices trying to survive what they're feeling. Have you ever noticed how some decisions are born in moments when you can no longer think clearly? In relationships, at work, inside your own home. There are people smiling on the outside while emotionally exhausted on the inside. And it's in that condition that dangerous decisions begin to appear, because a tired heart starts confusing relief with direction. The person doesn't want to create chaos, they just want the pain to stop. But many times, what feels like an immediate solution ends up creating even greater conflicts later on. And that's exactly why Sarah's story is so profound. Because it doesn't begin with a mistake, it begins with a promise. Genesis 12:2-3 shows God telling Abraham that he would become the father of a great nation. It was something clear, strong, and certain. But between receiving the promise and seeing it fulfilled, there is a space very few people can endure: the waiting season. And it was precisely in that journey between what God had spoken and what still hadn't happened that emotions began slipping out of control. The most striking part of this story is that Sarah didn't lose everything all at once. The changes started small, silent, almost invisible. One thought here, one restless feeling there, one attempt to help something that seemed to be taking too long. And without realizing it, she began accelerating processes that were still being built. Because there's something many people never understood. Some of the greatest mistakes in life are not born out of evil. They are born out of the anxiety of wanting to fix too quickly what still requires time. The promise that takes time. In Genesis 12:2-3 and Genesis 15:4-5, God makes a direct promise to Abraham. He would become the father of a great nation, and his descendants would be beyond counting. Even without children, even as time kept passing and age continued advancing, the word was spoken with clarity. The text reveals that it was not a possibility, it was a declared certainty. But time begins to pass. The days keep accumulating, and what was spoken does not happen within the expected timing. Sarah is inside this story, living through every detail of that waiting season, watching the promise exist, but not happen. Have you ever noticed how difficult it is to keep believing when nothing changes? Maybe you've already lived through that. At some point, life begins, demanding answers you still do not have. You continue doing what is right, but deep inside, something begins to grow restless. And when that restlessness increases, thoughts begin to appear that seem like solutions, but may carry consequences you still cannot see. And then the question becomes, what have you been feeding while waiting for what still has not happened? The mistake that looks like a solution. In Genesis 16:1-2, after years of waiting, Sarah makes a decision that completely changes the course of the story. Without seeing the promise fulfilled, she gives Hagar, her servant, to Abraham as a way to solve what still had not happened. The text shows that it was not an impulsive act, but a decision carefully built over the long season of waiting. From a human perspective, it made sense. It seemed like a reasonable alternative in the middle of the delay. But what looked like a solution was actually beginning to create a path of conflict that was still invisible at that moment. Have you ever noticed how sometimes you do not give up? You simply change the way you try. At some point, the internal pressure grows so strong that you begin adapting what you believe to your own way of doing things. You try to help, try to accelerate, try to adjust the process so you do not remain stuck. But not every solution truly solves something. Some only postpone the problem and make everything more complicated later. And the question that remains is what you are doing today really an answer, or just a way to relieve the weight of waiting? The invisible consequences. In Genesis 16:4-6, after Hagar becomes pregnant, the atmosphere inside the house changes completely. The text shows that what once looked like a solution begins creating tension, comparison, and resentment between the two women. Sarah feels despised, Hagar begins behaving differently, and Abraham finds himself in the middle of a conflict that did not exist before. The strongest part of this narrative is realizing that the problem does not begin with shouting or dramatic events, but with silent changes in behavior and in the atmosphere itself. A decision made to relieve pain ends up creating a new pain inside the very same home. Have you ever noticed how some choices change the atmosphere without anyone needing to say a single word? The environment feels strange, relationships become heavy, and even silence starts feeling different. Little by little, comparisons begin to appear. Hidden guilt begins growing. Thoughts nobody talks about begin consuming people internally. And the hardest part is that many people only realize the weight of a decision when they are already living inside its emotional consequences. Because decisions made out of anxiety do not affect only the moment. They change your peace, the way you think, and even the way you begin seeing yourself. And how many people today are pretending everything is fine, while carrying conflicts that were born from choices made in emotional exhaustion. When the mistake changes relationships. In Genesis 16:15-16 and Genesis 21:9, Ishmael is born, and what once seemed like only a temporary alternative becomes a permanent part of the story. The years continue passing. Isaac is later born, but the tension inside the house does not disappear. On the contrary, it grows with time. The text reveals small signs of division, discomfort, and conflict between the sons and between the women. What began as an attempt to solve a season of waiting ends up completely changing the dynamic of that family, creating wounds that would not easily disappear. Have you ever noticed how some decisions never affect only you? They move through relationships, change environments, alter connections, and slowly make people drift apart. Some choices seem personal in the beginning, but later they begin reshaping everything around them without anyone being able to control it. And the hardest part is when you look back and realize certain relationships never became light again the way they once were. Because emotional consequences do not stay trapped in the moment they were created, they continue echoing long afterward. And how many people today are living in a heavy environment without realizing everything started with a decision made while trying to relieve immediate pain? God does not abandon, but He corrects. In Genesis 17:15-19 and Genesis 21:1-2, even after all the confusion created by Sarah's decision, God reaffirms the promise once again. The text shows that Isaac would be born exactly as had been spoken from the very beginning. Years later, Sarah finally gives birth to the promised son, not through human effort, but in God's appointed time. This reveals something profound. The promise had not disappeared. It simply would not follow the pace of human anxiety. And even with mistakes along the journey, God continues guiding the story without ever losing control of it. Have you ever noticed how, even when everything feels messy, there is still a path being guided above what you can understand? There are moments when a person looks at their own choices and thinks they ruined everything, went too far, or that there is no way back anymore. But Sarah's story shows that mistakes do not erase the promise. They only make the process more painful than it needed to be, because God continues working even in the middle of consequences we created ourselves. And this brings an important reflection. How many times have you confused delay with abandonment when in reality direction was still being built silently? The weight of trying to control everything. In Genesis 18:12, when God once again confirms that Sarah would have a son, her reaction is laughter. Not laughter filled with joy, but laughter weighed down by exhaustion, disbelief, and emotional fatigue. After waiting for so many years, it all seemed far too distant from reality to still feel possible. The text reveals a woman who had already tried solving the situation in her own way, and now looked at the promise with difficulty believing in it. Because when the mind spends too much time trying to control everything, even what once produced hope begins to feel impossible. Have you ever noticed how the need for control slowly exhausts you internally without you realizing it? A person tries to predict everything, solve everything, understand everything, and little by little loses the ability to rest. And when that happens, even faith begins weakening silently. Not because you completely stopped believing, but because emotional exhaustion makes you look at the future with suspicion. It is as if the heart begins protecting itself from disappointment before anything even happens. And how many times has the fear of suffering again made you stop believing in what once felt so alive inside you? What Sarah's story reveals to us. Sarah's story reveals something many people never noticed while reading this narrative. The greatest problem did not begin with the promise. It began with the attempt to accelerate what was still being built. Sarah did not completely stop believing. She simply grew tired of waiting. And when anxiety takes up too much space inside the mind, a person begins feeling like they need to do something just to avoid standing still. But not every movement means direction. There are decisions that seem wise in the moment, but carry silent consequences that only appear later. And when looking at all of this, 3 lessons become difficult to ignore. The first is that not every sense of urgency needs to become an immediate decision. The second is understanding that waiting is also a position, even when nobody sees anything happening. And the third is realizing that not everything that looks like a solution truly comes from God. Because there are paths that relieve anxiety for a few moments, but create even heavier burdens later. Sarah reveals exactly that. When human beings try to control timing, they end up producing conflicts they never needed to live through. Have you ever noticed how many times you tried solving something simply because you could no longer endure waiting? How many decisions were born more from emotional exhaustion than from clarity? There are people living today with consequences that began in choices made out of pressure, fear of falling behind, or the need for quick answers. And the strongest part of this story is realizing that many mistakes are not born out of evil. They are born out of the silent desperation of wanting pain to end quickly. But accelerating processes can also delay what was being built the right way. Sometimes, what is changing your story is not what you did wrong, but what you tried to solve without God. And if this message spoke to you, write this in the comments. I need to learn how to wait. That helps this video reach people who are living through this exact conflict today. And if you enjoy this kind of deep reflection about biblical stories applied to modern life, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there are silent decisions happening inside you right now, and understanding them may completely change the direction of your life.